Hello, you're listening to the very first episode of the Virtuality Podcast, and I'm Craig Herndon, and this is my co-host.
Neil Gupta.
So Neil is the lead organizer of Boston Augmented Reality, and I'm the lead organizer of Boston Virtual Reality. The purpose of this podcast is to service this Boston reality community, which encompasses way more than just virtual reality or augmented reality. And the reason for that is VR encompasses and is going to impact so many different industries, from education, engineering, healthcare, logistics, media and entertainment, military, transportation, tourism. It's already hit video games, retail, commerce, marketing. And then just like with the different other technologies, we have 3D printing, big data, artificial intelligence, wireless sensor networks, the Internet of Things, and of course, Industry 4.0. So with all these different technologies and industries that are now, as they get developed, have more and more synergistic effects across each other, we find it important that we really need to be covering all of these and not just VR or just AR. So we're definitely going to be talking about, we might bring on someone from the AR community or the VR community, but we'll also have people from artificial intelligence, machine learning, and just experts in these different areas where there's overlap between VR and AR. And we think it's very important for a show like this that we go ahead and explain what is virtual reality, what is even augmented reality. So Neil, I'll let you take over on the reality spectrum.
Cool. So I think virtual reality, augmented reality, even mixed reality are terms that everyone has heard. To give some definitions to them that everyone would understand, virtual reality wants to bring you to a completely different environment or experience. It wants you to feel like you're somewhere else. At its core, augmented reality and mixed reality, they actually want you to be very firmly rooted in the environment you're in. So augmented reality in its classic definition is providing information and data about the world around you that you're seeing. So if you had a heads-up display in your car that told you your speed or something like that, that could be augmented reality. Mixed reality is a newer term that Microsoft came up with when they released the HoloLens, and this is because now we actually have this interface of augmented reality where we can manipulate objects and interact with objects. So more than just seeing data augmented on our world, it's objects mixed into the world. So it'll look like there's a Coke can on the table even if it's not there, or it'll look like there's a dog running around the room when there isn't one. So those are sort of the terms that you might hear and the basic definitions that distinguish them.
Yep, and just another example on that would be if I'm typing on my keyboard and I want to see my keys get pressed as I'm in VR. That would be another example of that mixed merge kind of thing where I'm pressing real world keys, but I'm seeing in VR virtual keys getting pressed as I do that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Bringing that real world into the virtual world.
Yep. So it seems like there are just more and more terms coming in. I've even seen where people are trying to throw the spectrum that we just said, they're trying to throw it out the door to try and, throw in all these different subsets that may not be included in there. And it's really just taking mixed reality, which it basically covers the spectrum, is so broad that people are just trying to define it more and more narrowly to specify whatever it is they're doing. So, for example, there's a new one is extended reality. Which is, if you've ever used the Epson headset, they're made for drone racing. So that would be extended reality where you're controlling, this object that you're not even present for. Or if you're doing surgery and you're using robotic hands where you're not present, but you're in this virtual space, where you're controlling something that is real. So extended reality I would define as an experience that can impact the real world that you're actually not present for.
Nice. I like that. And that, that kind of ties in with how robotics is such a big component of virtual reality in the future.
Right. And I'm really curious to see how the Mars One mission is able to try and figure out some networking problems that you have the delay between, a Mars rover and, trying to control that. So right now, which is kind of where, again, we're talking about machine learning because this robot has to know that, I can't drive over a cliff. And it has to think for itself. And that's where we get on these overlap, because now we're talking about, extended reality, networking, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and they just all come into one solution, right?
Yeah, the way I kind of tie a thread between these things now is if you forget augmented reality for a second, with virtual reality, it's a completely sensorized environment, right? You can track everything that happened much more so than in the real world, right? So even if you and I were talking in this room in the real world, we can record our voices and we can have cameras. In VR, every single thing we do would be tracked. So there's a world where you can extract a whole lot of big data, so to speak, from these VR experiences. You can use that to power machine learning algorithms and help create more robust AIs. So that's sort of the thread that can tie these things together. And there's other ways to do so. And these AIs can then be used to power whether it's a chatbot or a robot or whatever it might be. But that's one of the ways in which all these frontier technologies actually come together to help you create a product as opposed to working on a particular technology.
Right. And so now that we have like those, basic definitions out of the way, I'd like to step back again and just kind of give a general overview of like what are the possibilities or where are these different industries going as far as like how VR and AR are playing into them. And these are things where, you could spend your entire PhD, trying to study, and we're going to try and sum them up in about 2 sentences. So, for example, MIT recently had a VR event that was a demo day for a 3-week course that was sponsored by Google. And there were lots of different things, the different kinds of demos. So one of them was classroom VR, which was like a whiteboard kind of interaction, very education focused. But
very collaborative as well.
Right. And there was also like, one that was like a video game, which was like an escape room experience.
There were a few, yeah. There were a few kind of escape the room, solve the puzzle sort of experiences, which was doing a good job of leveraging that headset VR experience, but making something really interesting.
Right. And Neil, the Boston AR actually had a Holo hack. Mm-hmm. So what were some of the projects that came out of that?
Yeah, so that was really cool. That was, I believe at the time, it was the most HoloLenses that were in one room at a time. Microsoft came and gave us 50 to use for the weekend, over 100 developers. And with that, we saw a couple of apps that were focused on social good. There were, interestingly enough, 2 that were meant to be assistive devices for blind people or people who are vision impaired. And I thought that was a really interesting use of the technology. One that was great was they were really thinking about when people are in hospital settings, outside of the actual care they're receiving, the hospital setting is designed for the doctors and the nurses and the medical staff, not so much for the patient. And they really thought, okay, how could we use this technology to enhance the patient experience, which has been proven to be a huge component of the healing process, so to speak. Okay. So a couple of folks, they got together and they made this kind of game that you could play from your room or from your bed or wherever, where it seemed like monsters were coming out of the wall, but they added this other element to it where it wasn't just monsters, it was the disease that you then got to attack and shoot red blood cells at, or if you saw the wall, you could try to cover it with platelets or things like that. So there wasn't so much of a maybe educational component of it. You weren't supposed to necessarily learn that, but I think for kids in the hospital, it sort of felt empowering to, 1, have a game to play, 2, it sort of felt like they were battling their disease. So that was a really, was one of my favorite ones.
Which is pretty, I want to say metaphorically awesome.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
To just, you're sitting there in the bed, you're sick, but you can fight your disease.
Right, yeah.
So you get destroyed in the room.
That sense of empowerment, I think it really is a big component of healing.
Right, and like other healthcare kind of uses, there's actually a local Luminopia where if you have a ocular disorder, it's actually VR. So right now, like what they do, if you have an eye that's a little bit out of sync, what they'll do is give you an eye patch. Watch a movie for like 30 minutes or an hour or something, and basically you're covering up your good eye and forcing the other eye to actually work because. I'm not a doctor, so I don't actually fully understand the disorder.
Just play one on a podcast.
But yeah, right. But my understanding of the disorder is that you basically have, one eye who isn't tracking what's in front of it because the other eye is tracking, right? Whereas normally both eyes are focused on whatever activity is going on in front of you, and you just have, when you do cover up one eye, that your brain still is basically like, hey man, we need to track this thing. You're the only one on the job right now. So you better get back to work and do it. So with VR, what we can do is kind of simulate reality a little bit better, but instead of just covering one up, now what we're doing is you have full control of the environment, where now instead of just covering up the eye, you can show a ball to only one eye, but the rest of the environment, both eyes can see. So with that, they can't say like for sure because they're still going under like testing and federal regulations, that kind of thing. But their current results have been up to like 50% accuracy, which is such a huge increase. So that's just like one healthcare example that I know like is going on in Boston right now.
Yeah, there's one really cool one I saw. So I went to Northeastern University for my undergrad, and I go back to judge the capstone program or capstone competition they have for their senior engineers. Daniel Levac over at Northeastern is a professor who works in their Regame VR lab, where they're looking to use VR technologies to better people's lives. And there was one app where, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm going to forget some of the specifics of the medical aspect, but it's something like if you get a stroke or something along those lines, your spatial awareness can sort of get adjusted or impacted, where you won't see things on the left side as much as the right or the other. And the way that manifests, or what you might see, is so someone who's afflicted with this might only shave half of their face because they just didn't realize, there's more to it, right? Because that part of their brain is working differently. So there's tests for this, but what this student group did was they made a room in VR that you had to poke all the little bubbles. And this way they could very quantitatively measure where are the parts in your spatial reasoning that are lacking, and how do we help you repair that. So that was another really interesting healthcare example, and that just came out of a few students and a few months of work.
Right. So now let's like take a moment and kind of speculate for all these other industries, right? So for industry, industry 4.0, I feel like the number one company that's got to be working on this right now is Amazon, trying to get this into their warehouses for logistics purposes.
Yeah, so industry 4.0, I've seen GE use this term when they call it the industrial internet, and they don't see it so much as Internet of Things and augmented reality is going to impact the consumer, although they know it will. Right. They really think that now when you're having machines talking to machines and being able to visualize that conversation, that's going to be very powerful. So I think from the enterprise perspective, that's when they talk about Industry 4.0.
Right. And so they're definitely talking more kind of B2B solutions with it. But I still think there's so much, again, we're talking about these synergies between overlapping of these things where, when you talk of devices talking to devices, you're getting into IoT. But now you're trying to make your manufacturing more efficient because if a device misses something, then the device can know. You just have so much more data to work with that everything can just run that much more efficiently and even account for errors that you previously wouldn't even know happened.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about big data in real world applications, that's where my mind goes to augmented reality, because now you can visualize that data. So you don't need any kind of visualization if it's really just the machines talking to machines. That can sort of happen, and maybe you can monitor that from a desktop or something. But when you have humans on the floor interacting with machines, then you need to have sort of a common language. And I think machines can adapt to whatever it is we do, but humans, we work best when data is displayed visually.
Right, in a simple fashion.
Right.
Because if you give me a bunch of dots, I'm going to be like, I have no idea what any of this means.
And this is, not to go too far off topic here, but this is what I think is so cool, where, yes, VR and AR exist. You can go to Best Buy and pick up, well, at least the VR stuff. But we're still so far from this technology being mature. I think there's a lot of the neuroscience that we still need to figure out, even outside of how do we experience this. But when you talk about with AR, make a simple experience. Well, it's really easy to, on some level, make a simple experience, but eventually you're going to have this neuro toolkit to tell you what is a simple experience. When we say simple, I think what we really mean is a low cognitive load, right? It doesn't take a lot of brain power. And understanding the best way to present data that requires the least amount of brain power, whether that's in augmented reality or what, I think that's a really fascinating area that's starting to emerge, is this consumer neuroscience.
Right. So I don't know. You say neuroscience. My first thought goes towards Neurable.
Yeah.
Who we recently got another $2 million in funding. So, I mean, you're basically controlling objects with your mind, which is pretty incredible. I mean, that's the most basic way to explain what they're doing. At least like if they try and demo it to you, they'll, you put on their stuff and there's a little ball on the floor, right? And then you're moving this with your mind. You think, let's move this forward, and there it goes. Like, pretty mind blowing.
Yeah, nice. Was that a pun?
It was.
Yeah,
quite
right.
intentional. Thank you.
Right on. Yeah, Ramses is doing some. I think Ramses Alcade is.
Yep.
He's doing some really cool stuff over there at Neurable, and that's exactly it, right? Like being able to understand the next thing beyond VR AR really is like the brain interface,
Right.
And that's what they're working on.
Yep. So let's see, what else have we like not covered? So military is like the most obvious thing. They've been the ones that have been interested in VR longer than anyone else.
Yeah, because
flight sims would be one of those. You had something to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, outside of visualizing things, it's simulation, right?
Yep.
So the military is all about training and regiments and being able to experience environments that are either too expensive or too dangerous to recreate.
Right.
So that's why simulation is so key for the military.
Right. And I know NASA is, again, another one of those entities that are doing that to, simulate spacewalking before you even go out and, walk on a satellite at terminal velocity, basically. And if you mess up, you die. So you definitely want to practice that a couple thousand times before you head out there.
Right. Yeah, Craig, when you mention VR work that's going on at NASA, it's interesting. There was some of that going on at Draper where they created a simulation for getting back to the International Space Station when you've been out doing some work on it. You've got this sort of jetpack that you use to bring yourself in. And it's really important that you do that efficiently so you don't, waste your resources or that you don't go off track and somehow miss the space station, so to speak. So that was originally developed on in a 2D format. And eventually they brought that more into a VR environment. The core of it is the same, but the level of immersion is obviously very different between a desktop and VR. And it is so different, you really hit this inflection point in terms of how the brain makes memories, how it responds to this training. And it's a lot more effective in terms of training the astronaut, which is your goal, to do so in the VR environment than purely on the desktop. Although I will say, having played it on the desktop, it's pretty fun.
So when I was at OC3, I actually got to meet Evelyn Morales, where she actually did give a talk on what she does at NASA, and it was exactly as I said, where she's training them to. She's been there like 20 years, right? So again, like they've clearly been doing this for a very long time, and they're just now, I think, starting to actually use like actual consumer grade stuff because it's gotten to the point where it's usable. Right. Mm-hmm. And it's better than this. Well, I wouldn't say better necessarily, but it's definitely easier to work with and develop new content for.
Right. You don't want some proprietary system where you've developed your own language for coding these VR experiences and you have to find someone to train them. Now you can just say, hey, if we're using an Oculus, if we're using a Vive, let's go find a Unity developer. We're good to go.
Right. Yeah. And so her virtual reality experience that she creates for these astronauts is to repair a satellite in VR before they actually go out and do it. But the thing that blew her mind more than anything is astronauts actually come back to her and say it actually wasn't that different from what we did in VR. Of course, it felt different. Like there's a little bit of the external senses, but as far as visually and like, when you went in to, change the bolt or whatever, like it was very much, they were able to do that pretty accurately. Mm-hmm. Even with like the physics that they did. So again, that's going to attribute to the minds at NASA that are able to do this to where an astronaut comes back from actually, doing for real what they practiced in VR for so long and saying, it made it so much easier to be up there than if I hadn't experienced it in VR before.
That's cool. We should come up with a term for that now, like deja vu, but for VR, like deja VR or something. I've seen this before.
In VR.
Yeah, right? You heard it here first.
If we're going to coin terms, with all these different industries, right? So all these different companies are definitely trying to get into VR right now. So you've heard of B2B. Well, now it's time for B2V. Get your business into virtuality. So that's definitely the term I'm going to use when referring to businesses trying to get involved in the virtuality space and how they can leverage this technology to get to their customers, make better relationships, train their employees. How can you make your business better with this technology?
Cool. Yeah. I think like in the consulting world, you're starting to see a lot of digital transformation is the hot term, right? How do you take a business that was otherwise, and that doesn't mean build a website, right? Like that's not digital transformation. It's how do you either create products differently, market products differently, or fundamentally change your business from selling products to selling subscriptions and services because of these new technologies that are out there.
Right. So one that would very much impact people here in Boston. So in another industry that kind of ties in here is transportation, which the way the MBTA has been functioning these past winters, I'm sure people are very interested in finding other ways. But the autonomous cars is like the bigger one right now, right? Can I get out of here and schedule my car to come in? Not my car. It's probably like a publicly owned car. Maybe it's Uber's car,
right?
Or maybe it's a government owned car that I just schedule, comes and picks me up at 3:00, and then I go home. Or do I walk out on the street and I know within 1 minute there's going to be a car that I just hop in, get in the back of, and there's no one driving it. It's just a bunch of people riding.
Yeah.
It's really cool just to see what that's going to be like.
Yeah.
But even before we get to autonomous, AR already has applications out there, right?
When it comes to driving and transportation?
Right.
Yeah, for sure. It really comes back to there's two ways to think about AR as it stands now. Are you really leveraging the hands-free computing platform where, for a car, maybe if you always want to be able to keep your hands on the steering wheel, but you need other information, AR can be very helpful, or the hands-free computing platform can be very helpful.
Right.
In other ways, it can be very helpful in terms of visualizing data around you, visualizing other things. When I talk about augmenting or augmented reality, I really do try to instead talk about augmenting reality, where it's more than just headsets. It's any time that you're interacting with data and using that to create an experience, that is augmented reality. So it could be over a headset. It could be a wearable that buzzes if you are too close to an electric field that you shouldn't be. Ben Cavallari actually came and presented at Boston AR about the startup he's working with called Proxy that does exactly that. So I count that as augmented reality. So on the road, on the transition to autonomous cars, we've seen these features rolling out over time, right? So your car, if it beeps because you're starting to switch lanes unintentionally, or if there's someone in your blind spot that you're not seeing as you're trying to merge, your car beeping at you, that is augmented reality, right? If we all had headsets in our car that instead of it beeping, it just kind of brought up text that said you are about to crash, that would be the same data just being displayed in a different way.
Right.
And more we're going to see these technologies that first assist the driver, right, make you safer.
Yep.
Then I think ease the driving experience, right? You have to do less. So the first couple of technologies like anti-lock brakes, that wasn't having you do less. That was something you were unable to do that it now provided you, right? Same thing with maybe, we'll stick with ABS. That's like a good one. But moving forward, if it's able to help you stay in the lane without you even doing anything, right? Now it's something that you easily could have done before, but you don't have to, right? And this is on the transition to fully autonomous vehicles.
Yep. So the next industry I want to move on to is, just talking about tourism, right? Where now I almost want to tie it over with advertising because you're able to give people, if you're looking to go places, right, you want to know what does it look like. You can go, throw on your headset, see what it looks like. But at the same time, it's, just another way to market those environments as opposed to just visiting it if you can't afford it.
Right. Yeah, I think travel and tourism in VR and AR, probably VR first, right? The whole concept of VR is to bring you somewhere else, to make you feel like you're immersed in different environments. So, being here in Boston and it's January or February now, certainly a VR experience that brought me to a much warmer environment would be welcomed. And, if it was only a teaser and it got me really thinking, this would be a great time to go to the Caribbean or whatever it might be, you could follow that up with, click here and we'll get you started on setting up this trip for real.
Well, right. And I think, the next step for that is once you actually are there. So if you're coming to Boston, you have your AR headset on. And when, once we have sensors everywhere, you're going to be able to walk up to the old State House and watch the Boston Massacre happen in front of you, with virtual British soldiers and people getting shot and, reactions, and, walk along the Freedom Trail and just be able to get all the information a tour guide would otherwise be giving you.
Mm-hmm.
And, you should basically have your own virtual tour guide.
Right. Yeah, and that'd be cool because that could sort of open up a marketplace, right? So I could see a company that enables this general concept of augmented freedom trail tours, and then they open it up where maybe this company has installed sensors along the way or marker-based AR along the way. They own that, and then they can make commission off the experiences. So maybe Craig will make a freedom trail experience that's focused on certain things. Someone else could make something very different, and then it really becomes a marketplace.
Right. So you're saying that the sensor that's there would basically be able to, I'd say, hey, this is this location.
Mm-hmm.
And then other companies can come in and do a different experience at that location.
Yeah, like maybe, you want to see more info about the Boston Massacre at one point, and maybe somebody else wants to see completely different information about what did this look like when there were no highways, right?
Yep.
And so picking and choosing your own sort of experience, right? The same way that you would pick and choose a different tour guide. If one said, I'm going to tell you all about the history of Boston from an economic perspective versus from a educational perspective or whatever it might be, right? And then one final note on that is it's cool because in the past, advertising hasn't really been able to learn from the consumer very easily. They do like focus groups and things like that. But now you could imagine if they're collecting this data of, okay, Neil tried 5 different VR travel experiences and he keeps on going to the sunny ones. Oh, Neil likes the sunny ones, right?
Yep.
And that's going to become that's sort of low level now. That's out there, right? And you can do that in brute force ways in existing media. But when you get to the next level of this platform, when you have eye tracking, and you say, not only does Neil like sunny environments, he always looks at palm trees. He's obsessed with palm trees. So forget where we take him. Just find the closest palm tree to Boston, Massachusetts, and he will buy that ticket, right? Or whatever it might be. So I think, tourism is certainly going to be a very cool one.
It's the personalization of the tourism that you think is going to really create that secondary marketplace.
Well said.
So the next thing would be I would say the obvious ones that are already happening right now. So I'm going to tie these all into one because they're separate, but it's media and entertainment, retail, commerce, marketing, and video games.
Mm-hmm.
Of course they're separate, but I feel like that's what's hit the market right now, and that's kind of what we're seeing is brands playing with how does my brand fit into this space, and can I make a cool experience that doesn't feel like advertising, but is something that's like, oh, you have to try that Ford experience because it is awesome.
Right. Yeah, the mixing of advertising and experiences, right? Like in the past, advertising always asked you for something, give us your attention for 30 seconds, or click on this thing, or like do this thing for us, not for you, right?
Yep.
Now, if there's a Ford VR experience where you can choose what Ford you want to do, whether it's a truck or a Mustang or a concept car, and it's a really fun experience, I mean, that still is a commercial for Ford in every way.
Yep.
It's still an advertisement for Ford. But now they gave something to me as opposed to needed my attention for something I didn't want to do.
Yeah, and so the next part where like commerce comes in is, can I buy the car right then and there?
Yeah.
And pick it up at my local dealership?
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming there's some laws in the way that's going to prevent that from happening.
If not, they will be. Yeah.
But it's, what is our interaction with these products and how we make purchases? How is that going to change as VR and AR takes up more of our time?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like the real core of this media entertainment aspect, because we have sports selling VR tickets to see an event. So Neil, I know you've actually given a talk on the future of sports recently. So you want to go in a little bit of that?
Yeah, I think so. There was a Future of Sports conference at the TD Garden that the Jacobs family hosted and commissioned and whatnot. And kudos to them for really thinking it wasn't the future of sports in 3 or 4 years, but over the next 20 to 40 years, what are sports going to look like? How are they going to change? With regards to VR and AR, there were certainly opportunities right now, right? So there's kind of the infinite seat where if you have a 360 camera, you could sell that kind of VR experience to as many people as you wanted. But kind of stepping back, there's so many ways that you can use these technologies to either increase the fan experience, when they're at the stadium, or increase the fan experience if they're not at the stadium, right? How do you think about those differently? Or you can also look at it about how do you make the augmented athlete, whether they're training in virtual reality or they're watching gameplay in VR again, so they're getting that kind of feedback. Or even on the back office, right? How can they make decisions better with new data that they can visualize or whatnot? So some of the specific things that you saw, certainly training right now is big. Striver that came out of Stanford is the big VR sports training company right now. Jeremy Balanton is in charge of Stanford's VR lab. Effectively, he's kind of very much a thought leader in the space. And with Derek Belch, who was Stanford's kicker actually when they beat USC in this very kind of legendary game down in LA, he, I guess, had been chatting with Jeremy about this for a while, saying, I want to create a sports training experience. Now they finally are at the point where the technology supports that, and they've made Striver that lets quarterbacks review footage. They've even turned it into kind of consumer experiences. So if you're at Madison Square Garden for a home game for the Rangers, you can pretend like you're a goalie and try that out. So
awesome.
Yeah, it's super cool, right?
Yeah.
So that's really cool for now. Where I see it going in the future is, and yeah, right now you can see a game in VR, and that'll become more prevalent and more ubiquitous. Companies like LiveLike are trying to do that. Next VR is trying to do that. But in the future, I think augmented sports is going to be very interesting. So as sort of a side, esports is becoming a big phenomenon. Yep. Maybe not even becoming, maybe is a big phenomenon.
I would say
right?
is.
Yeah.
There was even statistics that the World Championships eclipse that of the World Series Championship.
Oh yeah, and even more than NBA Game 7, all that. I mean, it's here, right? Maybe we just don't notice it yet, but it's here. And so, esports, and it's funny, I met a couple of the folks that are on Rick Fox's esports team, Echo Fox. And, they're video gamers, right?
Yep.
In the way that you would think about, these folks, they're really good at playing video games. Kudos to them, and that's their craft. As AR and sports kind of mixed together, you could see esports that they would be athletes in the classical sense, right? So if your esport game has you dodging things or jumping over stuff in augmented reality, you'll really need to actually do those things, right? So, in a simple way, you could imagine skiing where they had augmented markers you got to hit while you're skiing. Okay, then you actually need to be a skier, not someone who's really good at augmented reality video games.
Yeah, and I think as far as new things that are coming out, it's ever since, I want to say, because of Rocket League and how that came out as just being such a big phenomenon, that everyone that wants to get into esports are they're trying to think of more simple sports. Because the thing about Rocket League is, it's a normal video game. It's not VR, it's not AR, but it's just cars in a soccer stadium, and there's a giant ball, and you go around with your rockets trying to get it in the goal, right? Mm-hmm. So it was very simple. It's very easy for people to get into. And, when you think of esports, you think of a very complex game, but instead it was taking sports that we know and trying to make that, in a virtual experience. And I think that's what we're going to see a lot of is trying to bring sports, to gamers in a way to where they can be those e-athletes, right? Mm-hmm. And that's definitely something we're going to have to keep an eye on, because I think we're going to see a lot of very simple sports-like games or ones that can be called sports, even in, again, the classical sense because of how they operate. So that's definitely just something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, so I like this. This is, there's the e-athlete, like we're talking about. And then I think a totally different way of thinking about the technology is also the augmented athlete, right? So, for consumers, people like you and I, it would be great while I was running to have, a pair of sunglasses that made it look like I was Sonic the Hedgehog and collecting rings as I ran everywhere, right?
Yep.
Obviously, we are quite away from that technology being here yet. So if you're listening, please don't get super excited at that idea. But actually, I take that back. Please get super excited, build it, and let me know when it's out there. I'd love to try it.
So the thing is, it's what augmented athlete, right? So here's... if the Jacobson family's listening, here's what the Bruins should be doing, right? So you give them an augmented reality headset to the players, and you could have a play, right, that basically tells the players where they need to be at a certain time, and it'll tell them, hey, you didn't skate fast enough to get there in time. To get to the blue line to be in position, you need to skate this much faster. And that way you're giving metrics and direction to a play. So a coach can switch which plays are being practiced just by pressing a button, and it tells the players where to go. And you could just basically have this augmented practice of just telling players where to go, when to make the pass. And now you're like putting a time clock on it, right? So that way, like there's that sense of repetition that I don't think you can reach without having that extra information of whether or not you hit the clock. Because right now, the best we can do is, maybe a stopwatch or something. But I feel like with that positive, immediate reinforcement of, hey, I made it. It's definitely something that can help get that muscle memory exactly where it needs to be, because he'll know, all right, this is what I had to do to get to this point at this time. And you can also do like more complex plays because you're telling the player in real time where they need to be going.
Right. It's like a playbook on your face.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah. I find it kind of funny to picture that hockey went from no helmets to cages to visors to no visors to the HoloLens.
Right. Yeah, right. That's exactly what I'm suggesting.
Nice.
I don't think they'll actually be having it during game, but
right.
I feel like we're not too far off. Maybe another 5 years.
Yeah, and it goes back to this idea of you'll be able to quantify and measure everything, right? So you're saying, okay, you didn't hit the blue line. It's one thing if you watch it and you're like, you missed that pass, you clearly weren't there on time. If it was, hey, you missed it by not skating 3 strides, in this distance or 4% harder or whatever it is, you get to this quantified athlete. And, we all saw Moneyball. We see how on some level data can really help you win games. Imagine if you had, levels more data of much more meaningful data as well of actual performance, not just results.
Yep. Which, again, is ridiculously hard to quantify
right.
In sports, because either, you made the shot or you didn't.
Yeah. It's interesting, so what's powering a lot of augmented reality applications when people think about it, if you're not just thinking about, I want to look at data, but rather I want my headset to tell me information about the scene. Hey, I'm out camping. I want it to be able to tell me what trees I'm looking at. Is that poison ivy or something like that? Really what people are talking about is not augmented reality. What they're talking about is computer vision.
Yep.
And computer vision algorithms applied to the augmented reality headset. Because I could still have that same thing on a smartphone and just ask it, what is this object identification or classification or what have you. So, going back to the sports thing, if you had the right kind of camera setup all around the stadium or all around the rink, you could then tell me how far they missed the blue line, and then immediately put that data onto their headsets, right?
Yep.
So I think what I'm trying to get out here is the headset alone is the presentation device. The data that you collect to make that experience, some of that might come from the headset, some of it might come from external things. And this is why AR plus the IoT, plus the Internet of Things, these distributed sensors all around us, that's where you can make that's how you can make so many cool experiences.
All right, Neil. So I think what we're getting at here, we started at healthcare and we're moving all the way into the virtually augmented computer vision athlete.
Right.
So clearly with all these different industries and all this crossover, we could go on for days. But right now I want to take a step backwards and kind of look at the Boston virtual reality, how it got started, and kind of explore the history there, which is why we've brought the founders onto the podcast today.
I'm Neil Gupta.
And I'm Craig Herndon.
You can find any info in the show notes. Please subscribe on iTunes to listen again, and we'll catch you in this reality
or the next.
Thank you so much for listening. We would like to keep sharing more about VR and AR with you, so please consider a few dollars to our Patreon, linked in the show notes. The Virtuality Podcast is produced by Jason Parks and music by Rachel Dazinski. This podcast is in collaboration with Boston VR and Boston AR. Monthly meetups and events can be found on meetup.com. You can also follow us on Twitter @VirtualityCast and learn more at our website, virtuality.show.